Blumenthal spoke recently at the UN in reference to the Ukraine war. I think you need to hear what he had to say.
I now give the floor to Mr. Max Blumenthal.
Thank you, and I thank Alex Rubenstein and Wyatt Reed for helping me prepare this address. Wyatt Reed is a journalistic colleague of mine who in October 2022 happened to be in Donetsk when his hotel was shelled by the Ukrainian military with a apparently US-made howitzer, nearly killing him. He was 100 meters away. I'm also here with my friend, the civil rights activist Randy Credico, who was more recently in Donetsk and witnessed regular HIMARS attacks on civilian targets.
Randy Credico, for those who are not aware, he also spoke at the Assange rally that I went to in DC. He's a huge Assange activist.
I'm here not only as a journalist who spent over 20 years writing books, producing documentaries, and writing articles about conflict and politics from several continents. I'm also here as an American taxpayer who's been dragooned into funding a proxy war that has become a threat to the regional and international stability at the expense of my countrymen and women. Just June 28th, as emergency crews worked to clean up yet another toxic train derailment in the United States, this time on the Montana River, further exposing our nation's chronically underfunded infrastructure and its threats to our health, the Pentagon announced plans to send an additional $500 million worth of military aid to Ukraine. The development came as Ukraine's army enters the third week of a vaunted counteroffensive that CNN describes as, quote, not meeting expectations, and which even Volodymyr Zelensky says is going slower than desired. As Ukraine's military failed to breach Russia's primary defense line, CNN reported on June 12th that Kiev had lost, quote, lost 16 US-made armored vehicles sent to the country. So what did the Pentagon do? It simply passed that bill down to average US taxpayers like myself, charging us another $325 million to replace Ukraine's squandered military stock. There was zero effort to consult the US public's position on the matter, and the vast majority of Americans likely did not even know the exchange took place. This policy that I'm describing to you, which sees Washington prioritize unrestrained funding for a proxy war with a nuclear power in a foreign land while our domestic infrastructure falls apart before our eyes, exposes a disturbing dynamic at the heart of the Ukraine conflict, an international Ponzi scheme that enables Western elites to seize hard-earned wealth from the hands of average US citizens and funnel it into the coffers of a foreign government that even Transparency International ranks as consistently one of the most corrupt in Europe.
Did you guys notice what Max Blumenthal just did there? He made the connection between war abroad and domestic policy at home and economic issues at home. That's a good way to start that conversation.
The US government has yet to conduct an official audit of its funding for Ukraine. The American public has no idea where their tax dollars are going. And that's why this week, we at the Gray Zone published an independent audit of US tax dollar allocation to Ukraine throughout the fiscal years 2022 and 23. Our investigation was led by Heather Kaiser, a former military intelligence officer who served in Iraq and Afghanistan. We found, among many bizarre payments, a $4.5 million payment from the US Social Security Administration to the Kiev government. We found $4.5 billion worth of payments from the US Agency for International Development to pay off Ukraine's sovereign debt, much of which is owned by the global investment firm BlackRock. That amount.
It's interesting how we can pay off someone else's debt, but we can't. Oh, let me go.
Amounts to $30 taken from every US citizen at a time when 4 in 10 Americans cannot afford a $400 emergency. We found tax dollars earmarked for Ukraine, padding the budgets of a television station in Toronto, a pro-NATO think tank in Poland, and believe it or not, even rural farmers in Kenya. We found tens of millions to private equity firms, including one in the Republic of Georgia, as well as $1 million payment to a single private entrepreneur in Kiev. Our audit also revealed the Pentagon's $4.5 million contract with a company called Atlantic Diving Supply to provide Ukraine with unspecified explosives equipment. This is a notoriously corrupt company that none other than Tom Tillis, the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, previously lambasted for its, quote, history of fraud. Yet once again, Congress has failed to ensure these shady payments and massive arms deals are properly tracked. In fact, much of the military and humanitarian aid shipped to Ukraine has simply vanished. Last year, CBS News quoted the director of a pro-Zelensky nonprofit in Ukraine who reported that only 30% of aid was reaching the front lines. The embezzlement of funds and supplies is at least as troubling as the potential consequences of the illicit transfer and sales of military-grade weapons. Last June, the head of Interpol warned that the massive transfers of arms into Ukraine means, quote, we can expect an influx of weapons in Europe and beyond, and that criminals are now, as we speak, focusing on them. This May, a group of anti-Kremlin Russian exiles outfitted with gear supplied by the Ukrainian government was hailed by Western politicians for carrying out terrorist attacks in Russian territory using American-made Humvees. Although the group, the so-called Russian Volunteer Corps, is led by a man who calls himself the, quote, White King, and includes numerous open admirers of Adolf Hitler, described as neo-Nazis in U.S. mainstream media, the Western weaponization of this militia against Russian forces and Russian civilians has not prompted any outcry from Congress. And while the Biden administration has promised that it's keeping tabs on the weapons sent, a State Department cable leaked last December conceded that, quote, kinetic activity and active combat between Ukrainian and Russian forces create an environment in which standard verification measures are sometimes impracticable or impossible. The Biden administration not only knows that it cannot track the weapons it's shipping to Ukraine, it knows that it is escalating a proxy war against the world's largest nuclear power and daring it to respond in kind. We know this because back in 2014, and this timeline is so important, that's when NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that the war started following a U.S.-backed coup d'etat. President Barack Obama rejected demands from Kiev to send lethal offensive weaponry because, as the Wall Street Journal put it, he had a, quote, long-standing concern that arming Ukraine would provoke Moscow into further escalation that would drag Washington into a proxy war. When
You heard that? That was under the Obama administration. That Barack Obama didn't want to get involved because it would drag the U.S. into a proxy war. It would drag them into a proxy war. This goes all the way back to the Obama administration. Let's go on.
Donald Trump entered office in 2017, he attempted to hold the line on Barack Obama's policy, but was soon branded a Russian puppet by the Beltway press corps and the Democratic Party for refusing to send Raytheon's Javelin missiles to the Ukrainian military. His reluctance to send the Javelins became a central theme of his impeachment, and he predictably relented. As U.S.-made offensive weaponry began to reach the front lines of the Donbass, the collective West exploited the Minsk Accords to, quote, give Ukraine time to arm up, as the former German Chancellor Angela Merkel put it. In January 2022, the U.S. announced a $200 million arms package to Ukraine. Follow the timeline. By the 18th of February, observers from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe reported a doubling in ceasefire violations, with OSCE maps showing the overwhelming majority of targeted sites on the side of pro-Russian separatists in Donetsk and Lugansk. 5 days later, Russia invaded Ukraine.
Let's just remember the timeline. You know, sometimes it's easy to forget because it's been a while, like obviously, but starting with the Obama administration, going into the Trump administration, Max Blumenthal just told you that also Trump wanted to uphold this same rule that Obama had, but then was smeared as like a Russian puppet. You see what they do? This is why they use the smears to get you to change your position. Let's go on.
And since then, the U.S. and its allies have been scurrying up the escalation ladder at every opportunity. Quote, things we couldn't give in January because it was escalatory were given in February, a former State Department official complained after meeting with Ukrainian counterparts. And things we couldn't give in February, we can in April. That has been the distinct pattern, starting with, for crying out loud, Stingers, referring to shoulder-mounted rockets. Joe Biden himself said in March 2022, the idea that we're going to send in offensive equipment and have planes and tanks, don't kid yourself. No matter what you all say, that's called World War III. Just over a year later, Biden changed his tune, backing a plan to provide F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine, and after pressuring Germany to send in the tanks he once feared would provoke World War III. It would only take 2 months from the time Ukraine received HIMARS, Lockheed-made HIMARS systems, for the U.S. for the Ukrainian military to begin targeting critical infrastructure, using them to strike the Antonovsky Bridge over the Dnipro River, and again, 2 months later, in a test strike on the Kakhovka Dam to see if the Dnipro's water could be raised enough to stymie Russian crossings, as the Washington Post reported. 3 weeks ago, the Kakhovka Dam was destroyed, triggering a major environmental catastrophe that caused mass flooding and contamination of the local water supply. Ukraine, of course, blames Russia for this attack, but has produced no evidence.
That piece right there is very important, that he stressed the fact that they haven't produced the evidence. This is key. And this has been happening throughout, where it's like, oh, well, so-and-so, they did this, they did that. Where's the evidence? And all it takes is for Zelensky to say that, and the mainstream media captures that narrative, spreads that narrative to millions of people in this country, and then everybody else believes it too. And not one person sits back and says, hey, do they have any proof that happened? That's how narrative control works.
Around this time, Ukraine also baselessly accused Russia of planning a provocation at the Zaporozhye nuclear plant. This triggered a resolution by Senators Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal, no relation to me, calling for NATO to intervene directly in Ukraine and attack Russia if such an incident occurred.
Remember that? This reminds me of the Boondocks. Uncle Ruckus, no relation.
Move by Blumenthal and Graham thus established a de facto red line for initiating U.S. military action, much like the one set down in Syria, which, as a former U.S. diplomat commented to journalist Charles Glass, was an open invitation to a false flag. Will we see another Duma deception, but this time in Zaporozhye? This time with nuclear consequences? Why are we doing this? Why are we tempting nuclear annihilation by flooding Ukraine with advanced weapons and sabotaging negotiations at every turn?
Money. That's why. Money, money, money. By the way, I honestly, 1 second. Sorry, it was a sneeze. By the way, something I noticed, it seems like Max hasn't even taken a breath yet. Just FYI. I'm like, how is he talking this fast for this long?
We've been told by people like Senator Dick Durbin that Ukraine is literally in a battle for freedom and democracy itself. And therefore, anyone who opposes military aid to Ukraine opposes the very defense of democracy, according to this logic. So where's the democracy in Vladimir Zelensky's decision to ban opposition parties, to criminalize the media outlets of his legitimate political opponents, to jail his top political rival and his deputies, to raid Orthodox churches and jail clergymen? Where is the democracy in the Ukrainian government's imprisonment of Gonzalo Lira, an American citizen, simply for challenging the official narrative of Ukraine's war? And
yeah, they've been taking down the journalists that have a different narrative about this war. It's crazy that people can just be imprisoned.
Where is the democracy in Zelensky's recent decision to suspend elections in 2024 on the grounds that martial law has been declared? The answer is that Ukrainian democracy is harder to find these days than that country's commander-in-chief, Valery Zaluzhny.
For the people, some people may that disagree with the gray zone's position on this war. Going through the timeline that he just gave, where's the lie? Something to think about.
Senator Lindsey Graham has offered a much more grim and more on-the-mark rationale for supplying Ukraine with billions in weapons. As the senator boasted during a recent visit with Zelensky in Kiev, the Russians are dying. It's the best money we've ever spent. I repeat, the Russians are dying. It's the best money we've ever spent. And Graham has also said that Americans are ready to fight this war down to the last Ukrainian. While official casualty numbers are strictly classified, we must worry that Ukraine is well on its way to fulfilling the senator's ghoulish fantasies. As a Ukrainian soldier complained this month to Vice News, we don't know what Zelensky's plans are, but, quote, it looks like the extermination of its own population, like of the combat-ready and working-age population. That's it. Indeed, military cemeteries in Ukraine are expanding almost as rapidly as the Northern Virginia McMansions and beachfront estates of executives from Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and assorted Beltway contractors benefiting from the second highest level of military spending since World War II. These are the real winners of the Ukraine proxy war, not average Ukrainians or Americans or Russians. The winners, or Europeans for that matter, the winners are people like Secretary of State Tony Blinken, who spent his time between the Obama and Biden administrations launching a consulting firm called West Exec Advisors, advisors, which secured lucrative government contracts for intelligence firms and the arms industry. Blinken's former partners at WestExec include Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines, CIA Deputy Director David Cohen, former White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki, and almost a dozen current and former members of Biden's national security team. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, for his part, is a former and possibly future board member of Raytheon, and an ex-partner of Pine Island Capital Investment, which collaborates with WestExec and which Blinken himself has advised. Meanwhile, the current U.S. ambassador to this body, the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield, is listed as a senior counsel at the Albright Stonebridge Group, a self-described commercial diplomacy firm that also finesses government contracts for the intelligence and arms sector, and which
Max is out here naming names.
was founded by Madeleine Albright, infamously known for her comments that the deaths by sanctions of 500,000 Iraqi children were worth it. So while military-age Ukrainian men are ripped off the streets by military police and sent to the front lines, the financially and politically connected architects of this proxy war are planning to walk through the revolving door to reap unimaginable profits once their time in the Biden administration is over. For them, a negotiated settlement to this territorial dispute means an end to the cash cow of close to $150 billion in U.S. aid to Ukraine. So in
And when we talk about the billions of dollars, first of all, again, I don't know how he talked that fast for that long. Like, and he's going through the notes. I would have already lost my place. Like going through the notes, I'd have been like, where did I leave off again? But anyway, the money that is being spent here in reference to the US government, but the money that's also being made. Where does everybody fit in reference to this? BlackRock is invested in this. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon invested in this. Who's really winning and who's really losing? The Ukrainian people, they're not winning, right? Zelensky seems to be winning. I know he making some money, right? The Russian people aren't winning right now. Like this, who's winning in this conflict? And when we go back to the Pentagon documents that were leaked, one of the items that was leaked was that there was no plan for the US government to stop or call for a halt to this war at all this year, and about the real implications of regime change to get rid of Vladimir Putin. Isn't that usually what it's about? Removing leaders of other countries? Do you know how bizarre that is? Imagine, sit here and think for just a second. Imagine if Germany said, we're going to remove your president. We're going to remove President Biden. And just like toppled him over. I mean, like Biden need to go, but just in general, that's how wild that is. If you really think about it, that's wild to just topple over leaders in other countries and replace them with who we want and who's going to serve the American agenda, the financial agenda, and the best interest for the American government the best. That really is wild. When you think about it, that's the US government policing the world.
When the United States, my country, a permanent member of this council, has fallen under the control of a bipartisan regime which seeks to perpetuate a proxy war for as long as it takes, in the words of Joe Biden, which considers diplomacy synonymous with unilateral coercive measures to, quote, turn the ruble to rubble, as Biden pledged to do, whose leadership subverts negotiations in order to pursue profit while refusing to properly inform its own citizens what they're paying for, and pushes the sons and brothers of its supposed Ukrainian partners out onto a killing field in order to bludgeon a geopolitical rival, when both Zelensky and members of U.S. Congress are calling for preemptive strikes on Russia, which have nothing to do with Article 51 of the UN Charter, this council must take action to enforce that charter. That charter is clear that the Security Council must use its authority to guarantee a pacific settlement of dispute, particularly when it threatens international security. That should not only apply to Russia and Ukraine. This council has an obligation to strictly monitor and restrain the U.S. and the illegal military formation known as NATO. Thank you.
And with that, drop the mic. Drop the mic with that. Now, one of the questions that I have in reference to these address that people have to the UN, what happens after the address? Because like, well, what happens after that? Is there some type of follow-up from the UN? Do they follow up with Max Blumenthal? Is there some type of communication? Excuse me, sorry. I'm gonna do it again. I'm so sorry. Is dusty allergies. Anyway, what happens? Is there some type of communication? Is there a follow-up? I want to know. I'm curious. That's just a genuine question because Aaron Mate has addressed the UN multiple times. Max Blumenthal has addressed the UN. They're not alone. Other people have as well. But then what is the next step? What does the UN do? Do they actually sit there and look at the information that Max presented to them? Do they look at it? Do they do anything? Could we argue, this is the UN Security Council on Ukraine aid, this is a serious issue that the US has been just spending this money like this. And then you have people in this country that don't even have a roof over their head. You have a homeless population that's continued to increase. But billions have gone out the door to another country. You're not even helping people at home. And if you're not even helping people at home, could you make the case that this is a human rights issue? Look at a place like Los Angeles. Look at San Francisco. Look at all these homeless people out on the street. And don't come at me with, all those people were on drugs. No, some of those people lost their homes. Some of those people were evicted. Isn't this a human rights issue? When billions of dollars are going out the door to another country and we're not taking care of people right here in this country? This is something I want you guys to think about. And I think someone needs to make that claim. Now, you can see this on the Gray Zone. If you want to watch this again, Max Blumenthal addresses UN Security Council on Ukraine aid. I think someone needs to address that. Address it. Now, Sunday, I'm going to be talking about the student loan debt, which was struck down by the Supreme Court. No surprise from me. But I'm going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what's happening to people in this damn country and how the president and our congressmen and women, they are neglecting the people. And that's how I want you to come in, whether you agree with canceling student debt or not. I want you to look at this as a position of neglect. And the people in this country have been neglected by our politicians and by the corporations. And that's why I say, and I'm going to say this right now, some of you that still believe in this vote blue no matter who, or you got Trump derangement syndrome, if you were for canceling student loan debt, and you go out there and you give your support and your vote to Joe Biden anyway, you're a damn fool. I said it. You're a fool. Don't you go to those polls and vote for Joe Biden without making him do something before. So for all of you who are upset about the student debt cancellation, withhold your vote from Joe Biden. How about you do that? Make some damn demands, damn it. Seriously. That don't make no damn sense to me. Ain't no way in hell you could get me to do it. There's no way. Withhold your vote. The Debt Collective. You're on Twitter. You had a meeting today. This is what happened. It's canceled. Biden's going to try to do this, try to do that. I'll get more into it on Sunday. But I ain't heard the Debt Collective tell you to withhold your damn vote until it's done. So you guys not serious neither. Give me a break. Give me a break. Where were you? Where were you when Lucy and the Indie News Network had a freaking student debt summit, an all-day summit? You were invited. You didn't show up. Where were you? Damn sure won't invite them on here now. I don't think they would want to hear what I have to say. But this is some bullshit. If you guys go out there, you still go out there and you still support him after this? Come on. Give me a break. Give me a break. Ain't no way. Too old for this, man. I'm too old for it. Thank you for the super chat, Marco. We can't forget that all these things we talk about are capitalists. Cooked books in all aspects. There you go. Thank you, Marco. A lot of folks have 401ks tied to death and greed. I see why these people can't let go. They'll lose their retirement. That's a good point. Thank you, Lorez. Obama worried about arming Ukraine. He couped it in 2014. You go. And thank you, Frank. I think the Ukraine war is going to be the nail in the coffin for the United States. Max Blumenthal is the truth. Well said. Very well said.